The wind blew gently over the newly formed earth, carrying with it the scent of leaves, dew, and the promise of a new day. Among green hills and crystal-clear streams, Eve felt life pulsing inside her again. This time, it wasn't just the beating of her own heart, but of another being, small and fragile, growing inside her. She had already experienced the pain of childbirth once when she gave birth to Cain. Now she was carrying a second child in her womb. Time passed, and when the time finally came, the pain came like waves, intense and uncontrollable. But Eve already knew this battle. Holding the earth firmly in her fingers, she heard Abel's first cry. Small, delicate, different from her firstborn. While Cain was born as a promise of strength, Abel arrived as a breath of hope. The days turned into weeks, the weeks into months. Abel grew up hearing the stories of a time he had never seen, a perfect garden, a God who walked among them, and a choice that changed everything. But he didn't know Eden, only the shadows of what it had once been. The world he was born into was a place of hard work, where the once generous earth now demanded sweat and effort. Check out more Bible stories full of emotion by subscribing to the channel now and activating the bell to receive all notifications. If you like the content, feel free to support our work with a donation by clicking on the Thanks a Lot button. You can also become a member of the channel and enjoy exclusive benefits. But there was something different about him. While Cain was busy working the land, Abel was watching the stars. While his older brother toiled among stones and thorns, he preferred to lead his sheep through the fields, feeling the wind dance through his hair. His connection with creation went beyond survival. He perceived something greater in the details, in the breeze that swayed the grass, in the glow of the evening sky, in the soft bleating of a newborn lamb. Time passed, and the boys grew up. Abel, with his calm gaze and patient gestures, learned to guide the flocks. Cain, always with clenched fists and a firm gaze, dedicated himself to cultivating the land. Two brothers, sons of the same womb, but shaped by different paths. Cain spent his days bent over the hard soil, plowing, sowing, pulling weeds. Sweat dripped down his forehead, mixing with the dust stuck to his skin. The earth, punished by the curse, was stubborn. At times, it refused to bear fruit. At others, it demanded more effort than he wanted to offer. But Cain didn't give up. After all, if it was to be his livelihood, then he would beat it with his bare hands. Abel, on the other hand, walked free through the fields. His flock grew strong under his care. He knew each sheep by name, understood their calls, knew when they needed water, shade, or rest. He enjoyed watching the sun filter through the leaves of the trees, feeling the cooling breeze after a hot day. And while Cain sank his toes into the dry earth, Abel spent his days among pulsating life, surrounded by animals that depended on him, trusted him. The two brothers, so different, worked side by side, but there was something subtle, almost invisible, that separated them. Cain relied on his own efforts, on the weight of the hoe against the ground. Abel, on the other hand, seemed to see beyond what was in front of his eyes. He saw purpose in what he was doing and felt that everything around him told a bigger story. The sun was already setting over the horizon when Abel looked at his flock and knew what he needed to do. Ever since he was little, he had heard his parents talk about the Lord, the Creator who had given them life, and also the land where they now lived. It wasn't just a distant story. Abel felt his presence in every detail of creation, and now he wanted to express his gratitude. He walked among his sheep, running his hand along the soft back of each one until he found the chosen one, young, strong, without any blemish or defect, the best of his flock. As he prepared the offering, he felt a deep peace. He didn't do it out of obligation, but because he knew deep in his heart that God deserved the best. Cain was also preparing his offering, but unlike his brother, his expression was different. He had chosen some of the fruits of the earth, something harvested from his sweat and effort, but there was something strange in his eyes. His offering didn't come with the same open heart. He did it because he had to, because it was expected of him, not because he wanted to offer something real. When the time came, the two brothers presented their offerings to the Lord. The sky seemed to gasp in anticipation. Then something happened. Fire descended, consuming Abel's sacrifice. It was a sign that God accepted his offering, that the Creator's gaze rested on him with favor. But Cain's offering remained intact. The fire did not come. The silence was piercing. Cain's heart raced. The blood boiled in his veins. Rejection burned hotter than any fire. He looked at Abel, his brother, his own flesh, and something dark began to grow inside him. Cain stood still, looking at the offering that remained untouched. The smell of smoke rising from Abel's altar still hung in the air, like a bitter reminder of what had just happened. His chest rose and fell rapidly, his fists clenched, his jaw clenched. What had Abel done that was so special? Why had God accepted him and not him? Abel's gaze was serene, without a trace of pride or provocation. But this only irritated Cain even more. He wanted to see in his brother's face the same heaviness he felt in his own heart. But all he saw was peace. And that peace infuriated him. God noticed, he always does. His voice came soft but firm, cutting through the air like an invisible blade. "Why are you angry, Cain? Why is your face downcast?" Cain didn't answer. The fire in his chest burned too brightly. "Sin is at the door," God continued. "It wants to take you over, but it is up to you to resist." The words echoed inside him, but were pushed away. He didn't want to hear them. He didn't want to accept that the mistake was inside him and not outside. His heart was heavy, consumed by a feeling that was growing like a weed: envy. The days passed, but the anger didn't go away. On the contrary, it became greater, more suffocating. Cain began to observe Abel with different eyes. His brother's every gesture seemed like a silent insult. The sound of sheep, once so common, now irritated him. Abel's calm manner, his trust, his acceptance, all of it was eating him up inside. Then an idea formed in his mind. A dark, dangerous idea. He had to put an end to it. He needed to find a way to erase that feeling, to silence that voice inside him. Cain took a deep breath, trying to shake off the weight he was carrying in his chest. But it was no use. The rejection of his offer still burned inside him like live coals, and every time he looked at Abel, he felt the heat turn into an uncontrollable fire. His brother had done nothing to provoke his anger, and perhaps that was what infuriated him the most. Abel went on with his life in peace while he drowned in a sea of resentment. It was then that Cain had an idea. Simple, direct, fatal. That afternoon, he called him out into the field. The tone of his voice was the same as always, unhurried, with no sign of urgency. "Let's walk," he said. Abel didn't hesitate. He trusted his brother. Why wouldn't he? Since they were children, they had shared their bread, their home, their days under the same sun. The two of them walked far away, where the land was open and the wind blew unhindered. Abel walked ahead, unsuspecting. The sheep, which always seemed to follow him, stayed behind, watching from afar. The sky was clear, cloudless, but something hung in the air, something invisible but dense, like a shadow that no one could see except the one who carried it inside. Cain looked around. No one was around, just the two of them there, between heaven and earth, the perfect moment. Abel turned to say something, but didn't have time. The first blow came quickly, violently, accurately. A deafening sound broke the afternoon silence. Abel staggered, his eyes wide, not understanding. Cain didn't stop. His arms were raised again, and again, and again, until everything was still, until nothing moved. The field was silent. The wind stopped. Not even the leaves on the trees dared to move. Abel's body lay on the ground, his eyes open, staring at a sky he could no longer see. The blood flowed slowly, forming small red streams that seeped into the ground, as if the earth itself were weeping. Cain stood still, panting, his heart hammering in his chest. His hands were dirty, his fingers were shaking. What had he just done? Everything had happened so quickly, so brutally, that for a moment he couldn't believe it. But then his eyes went down, and there was Abel, motionless, breathless, voiceless, the first death, the first life snatched away by the fury of man. Silence enveloped him like a suffocating embrace. The whole world seemed to hold its breath. Cain took a step back, then another. He had to get out of there. He had to bury it, hide it. But something held him in place. It was a strange sensation, a chill running up his spine, as if someone was there, watching. There was no one, just him and his dead brother. But even so, he felt a gaze, an invisible but real look. Then the voice came. "Cain, where is Abel, your brother?" It was God. Cain swallowed. The weight of his guilt became even greater, but the shame quickly turned to hardness. He wiped his hands on his clothes as if he could erase what he had done, and replied with forced coldness, "I don't know. Am I my brother's keeper?" But the earth knew, the blood knew, and God, above all, knew. The divine voice came again, now louder. "Your brother's blood cries out to me from the earth." The air became heavy. Cain felt a chill run up the back of his neck, but it wasn't the wind. It was something deeper, something that squeezed his chest from the inside out. He wanted to run, but where? God's invisible gaze was on him. "Your brother's blood cries out to me from the ground." The words echoed like soundless thunder, laden with a weight impossible to bear. Cain looked at his hands again. The dirt was there, but it wasn't just dirt. Abel's blood still marked his fingers, sticking to his skin as if it would never come off. The earth, which had once provided her with sustenance, had now become her accuser. It had drunk Abel's blood, and now it cried out for justice. What had once been fertile soil now seemed cursed, rejecting him as God had rejected his offering. He tried to look away, but there was nowhere to run. Everything he saw, everything he touched, seemed to remind him of what he had done. Then the sentence fell on him like a definitive weight. "You are now cursed upon the earth," said God. "When you cultivate it, it will no longer give you its strength. You will be a fugitive and a wanderer in the world." Fugitive, wandering, without a home, without peace. Cain felt the ground shake beneath his feet. His punishment was not death. Perhaps if it had been, he would have accepted it with less despair. But to be forced to wander, without a home, without roots, without land to sustain him, that was a punishment that burned inside. Despair grew like a tight knot in his throat. His face burned, his breathing was ragged. He looked around, as if he could find a way out, but there was no escape. And that's when, for the first time, Cain's voice didn't come with anger or pride. It came shaky. It came weak. "My punishment is more than I can bear." The weight of condemnation fell on Cain like a rock impossible to carry. The world which had once belonged to him had now become a hostile place. He no longer belonged anywhere. He had no home, no land, no future. He would wander aimlessly, without roots, without rest. The thought terrified him. His heart raced, and fear, something he had never felt before with such force, rose in his throat like a trapped scream. He didn't want to die. Not like this. Not at the hands of others, who, upon learning of what he had done, might want revenge. "My punishment is too great," he muttered, his eyes burning. "Anyone who finds me will kill me." The anger that had once consumed him had disappeared. Now all that remained was the certainty that he was alone. But then something unexpected happened. God, even though he had seen the worst in Cain, did not abandon him completely. "It shall not be so," said the divine voice. And then a sign was placed on Cain, something invisible but carrying the weight of God's authority. Whoever found it would know that they couldn't touch it, that killing Cain would be an even greater mistake. He wouldn't be killed, but he would live with the weight of his mistake all his days. The land no longer wanted him. The home of his childhood, the fields where he had worked, the place where he had grown up alongside Abel. All this was lost. There was no going back. Cain turned and walked, without looking back. Every step took him further away from what he had once known. Dust rose around his feet. The world was vast, but for him there was no direction. And so, alone and wandering, he set off for an uncertain destination. Cain's steps were heavy, sinking into the earth that had once been his ally, and now rejected him. Each path he followed took him further away from his home, further away from his family, further away from God. But no matter how far he walked, the weight of what he had done stayed with him. Abel's blood still seemed to pulse on his hands, even after it had been washed away by the dust of time. The earth no longer accepted him. His hands, used to planting and harvesting, now held only emptiness. He tried to sprout something, but the earth denied him. The soil seemed cursed to him. Where there had once been life, there was now only denial. God's punishment was not just wandering, but the inability to put down roots. Everything he tried to build collapsed, and then Cain realized something terrible. He wasn't just a fugitive. He was a man without a name, no legacy. But life somehow went on. He reached a distant place, a corner of the world where no one knew his story. There, he decided to take up residence. He founded a town. He had children, and so his name didn't disappear. But no matter how hard he tried to build walls and give orders, no matter how much he built for himself, there was no peace. Abel's voice was never silent, because Abel's blood didn't die with him. It became a testimony, an eternal mark on history. Time passed, and his name echoed beyond the centuries, not for the reasons he wanted, but for those he could never erase. Time passed. Generations arose and disappeared, cities were built and destroyed, and the earth took its course. But Abel's name was never erased. His body decomposed in the ground, but his story lived on, echoing down the centuries. He was the first man to die, the first victim of hatred, the first to have his blood spilled unjustly. But he was not forgotten. Abel's blood cried out from the earth, and God heard. Not just on that day when he confronted Cain, but in all the ages that followed. Abel's sacrifice, made with sincerity and love, was accepted by the Creator, and his life became an eternal symbol of true faith. Men built kingdoms, multiplied, and the world became vast and populated. But the story of that young shepherd never lost its meaning. Abel left no descendants, built no cities, wrote no books, and commanded no armies, and yet his name has passed through time, carried by God himself. He was a harbinger of something greater. For one day, long after him, another blood would be shed. Another innocent would be killed at the hands of the unjust. Another sacrifice would arise, not just accepted by God, but definitive, capable of changing the fate of humanity. Abel's blood cried out for justice, but the blood of the one who would come after would cry out for redemption. And so Abel's story never ended completely. His name lived on, his footprints were marked in the earth, and his voice was never silenced. Abel teaches us that God sees beyond appearances. He didn't just look at the sacrifice, but at the heart of the one who offered it. His altar was not accepted because of what was on it, but because of what was inside it. His love for God was sincere, his desire was true, and his faith shone through even without words. But his story also shows us the danger of a hardened heart. Cain had choices. God warned him before it was too late. But resentment, envy, and pride spoke louder. Humanity's first murder didn't happen out of necessity, but out of jealousy. A heart full of anger doesn't need swords to kill. It kills with intentions, with thoughts, with what it nurtures in silence. Abel's blood cried out for justice, but thousands of years later, another blood would be shed, a blood that would not ask for revenge, but would offer forgiveness. If Abel was the first man to die unjustly, Christ was the one who took the injustice of the whole world upon himself. Abel's blood marked the earth. Christ's blood marked eternity. And today, Abel's story continues to echo. God still seeks those who worship him sincerely, who put him first, who give not the rest, but the best. And even in the face of a world where evil seems to thrive, Abel's voice reminds us that God sees, God knows, and God never forgets those who belong to him. If you liked Abel's story and want to continue following other stories of faith and overcoming, be sure to like this video and share it with those you love. And of course, subscribe to the channel so you don't miss out on any new content. Together, let's explore more powerful lessons from the Bible.